In this video lecture, we are going to ask and answer the question, can corporations have moral responsibility regarding climate change mitigation? We're going to be looking at an article of this title by Sade Hormio. First, we need to take a look at and understand the scope of climate change. So I'm going to present evidence for human-caused climate change, and I'm going to do that using a PowerPoint created by Dr. Charles Goodman. Now, there are three inconvenient truths. Inconvenient, and that it means humans ultimately have to change, their behavior. And we're going to take a look at each one of these three. So the first is that over the past few decades, the global climate has gradually been getting warmer. Some evidence for this: Berkeley Earth Surface Temperature Study, where we can see that now the surface of the Earth is, well above 1 degree Celsius, and this was, into 2010. It's much warmer, and we will not be able to meet the 2 degrees Celsius temperature that the Paris Climate Accord was supposed to stop at. We will go beyond it. Now we can look at record highs and record lows. Over the decades, record highs have gone up, record lows haven't been so much. And of course, it's also the fact that we can see the general average temperatures go up. We have the fact that there's less ice in the Arctic every year on average, right? Less ice. The graph is pretty clear about that. This is from PIOMAS. Evidence that Greenland, for example, the ice sheet is melting. So this is from dynamic ice loss from the Greenland ice sheet driven by sustained glacier retreat by Michaela King. Recent study, actually. Next, the primary cause of this warming is human activity in the form of emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. So we have this here. We can see current levels of CO2 that just are not like what we've seen throughout history. So we can see 400,000 years ago, a drop in CO2 levels. It goes up a little bit. There's a kind of baseline it hits. It goes down. Around 225,000 years ago, it hits and then goes down. And then yet you can see, roughly from the 19th century till now, there's just been this skyrocketing level of CO2 that now we have so much CO2 in the atmosphere that never before in the history of the Earth has there been this much CO2 in the atmosphere. So this, of course, the greenhouse effect. This is pretty basic science that you trap more greenhouse gases in some kind of an area like a greenhouse, and the radiation from the sun, that's going to heat up the temperature. This is pretty basic. So the more CO2 in the atmosphere, the warmer the planet is going to get. That's not disputable. Now, over 97% of actively publishing climate scientists believe that human-caused global warming is taking place. So we have independent data that verifies this. We also have the fact that scientists, climate scientists specifically, environmental scientists, overwhelmingly agree that the evidence says that human-caused global warming is taking place. Finally, if the climate continues to get warmer, this change will have, on net, at least some negative effects on the welfare of humans and non-human animals, and that is meaning the minimum. So there will be negative effects on humans no matter what. The question is, to what extent? Now, we know that based on predictions of climate models, we have lower to mid-continental soil moisture, more frequent droughts, more frequent heavy rains and floods, more powerful hurricane and tropical storms, heat waves that, become more intense. So how bad will it get? Well, some studies say that, some net economic damage of 1.2% of US GDP per every plus 1 degree Celsius of warming that we have on average. We know that the poorest third of US counties will suffer damage of 2 to 20% of county income under business as usual. And damage, of course, is much greater in hotter areas, and this means it's going to increase inequality. We can also look at examples of effects on the water. So it's not just the atmosphere, but the ocean is affected where it becomes more acidic. So, for example, this is causing the Great Barrier Reef in Australia to die. There's this process of bleaching. You can see that in 2016, 2/3 of the Great Coral Reefs were bleached. So 1/3 was fully bleached, meaning dead. The second third was undergoing the process of bleaching. Only 1/3 remains, vibrant as it has historically been. And we really have to, to think about who turned the wonder world of the seas into underwater cemeteries, bereft of color and life. And we have to come to terms with this. I think it's also important to look at U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by one industry. So we can see electricity, so basic, infrastructure needs, heating of the home or whatever. That accounts for about 29% of greenhouse gas emissions. Transportation accounts for 27%. Industry in general, like factories and so on, count for 21%. Commercial and residential 12%, and agriculture 9%. We should also look at the share of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, in 2011, we can see China had the biggest share of greenhouse gas emissions. The United States had the second most. But we should also keep in mind that if we look at historical emissions, the United States has emitted more emissions than any other country in the world, with China second. And CO2, it stays in the atmosphere for a long time. So the emissions emitted 100 years ago are still in the atmosphere. So the question is, what do we do about this? And specifically, are businesses morally responsible? Now, let's look at the terminology of corporate responsibility. So if we talk about corporate social responsibility, we're talking about the relationship of a business to society, and specifically, we're talking about what could be done, or what ought to be done in a voluntary manner, such that we could say a corporation has a responsibility to do charity work. Now, this is not something that the corporation must necessarily do, but it is something they could do if they so choose, right? It's within the realm of influence that they could have, but we wouldn't necessarily say they are a bad business if, they don't do that. Now, corporate moral responsibility focuses on closer stakeholder relationships. So it's not about what ought to be done, but it's about what has to be done. So this encompasses things like taking care of employees and customers, or not harming the environment the corporation operates in, over and above, just the value addition to shareholders. So a corporation has a responsibility, of course, to increase the value of shareholders. But here we're talking about what is the moral scope of this? What is it that they absolutely have a responsibility to do? So that is corporate moral responsibility. Now, the scope of responsibility really depends on the roots of that responsibility. So we want to ask, what ends does the business serve? Now, we can understand that all social institutions, whether public or private, have a constitutive collective end, meaning there's some constitutive joint activity of an institution such that it requires people in the community to show up and to work and to engage with, the community to serve some function, whether that be selling a product or doing social work or something like that. Now, they also have a collective good, meaning that there's something that's jointly produced which is desirable to the community. So it serves the end of the community in some way. Private institutions, though, have an extra kind of collective end, a third kind, and that is, of course, profit. Public institutions don't have to worry about profit. Public institutions do. What this means, though, is it puts a check a little bit on corporate responsibility. So it limits it to some extent, right? So One, for example, cannot demand that a private car company makes cars as safe as possible, because a private institution is only going to exist to the extent that they make profit. So we can say, well, there has to be a set standard for which you have to make cars safe, but you don't have to make them, as safe as technologically possible, if that means you can't make any profit. Now, we should also understand, though, that this doesn't mean all the responsibility, of course, goes to making profit, right? That it's not the case that corporations only have responsibilities to shareholders. The reason is that corporations don't exist in bubbles or outside societies. Instead, they have tangible effects on the lives of people around them, and that means they have a certain kind of responsibility to be aware of what those effects are, and whether they need to be mitigated or not. Now, in thinking then about corporate moral responsibility, first we have to acknowledge a company's primary obligation is to its primary stakeholders. So this, of course, involves shareholders, employees, managers, customers, and suppliers, right? This is what a corporation, in terms of what it's going to do, this is what it has to take into account first. Is it meeting the needs of these different stakeholders? Companies also, though, have obligations to communities in which they operate in, although, of course, that doesn't mean they have the same degree towards their core stakeholders. So there's some obligation, of course, right, with secondary stakeholders and the wider community, but that doesn't necessarily trump the core stakeholders. Now, the author says that, to use Verheine's examples, a company engaged in coal mining is responsible for the effects the mining has on the environment around where they mine, such as on the landscape and water supplies, presumably also on the inhabitants. The company is responsible for environmental damage brought about by the mining, and this comes under corporate moral responsibility, that this is not something they can influence, but they don't have to influence. No, because there is real tangible damage that can be done by business practices to core stakeholders. This means there's a corporate moral responsibility. It's not optional. But on the other hand, so this is the optional example, when a corporation makes a sizable donation to some charitable cause, it engages in a discretionary activity that comes under corporate social responsibility. And this could even be actually labeled as socially irresponsible if the corporation in question is short on funds. So, of course, if the corporation wants to donate money, but it actually doesn't have enough money to pay its employees, right? This would be an immoral account of corporate social responsibility. Now, corporations should then take into account multiple perspectives when they plan new ventures or products. Again, as the author says, the scope of the corporate moral responsibility is like gradually widening circles, with the corporation's employees and shareholders in the middle, extending to the supply chain and the wider social environment in which the corporation operates. A corporation cannot be held responsible for the poor labor law and human rights record of a country it manufactures in, but it can sometimes use its influence to promote better practices. So, of course, when we take into account that sphere, we can't hold a corporation responsible for the fact that where it exists, the country has poor labor laws. But we can hold them responsible for not acting according to set general standards, right, that they have the ability to implement. And that means, a corporation has the ability to influence better practices in a country. Now, taking all this into account, can we say that there's a corporate responsibility for climate change mitigation? Yes, but ultimately it's limited. So first, emissions from corporations do cause harm to stakeholders, but it's difficult to judge the extent that a specific corporation is responsible and for how much. Now, a carbon tax is a potential solution because it's just a blanket. We can see how much carbon you emit based on the activity you do, and then you pay a tax for how much you emit. The problem with this is that, this was a solution for climate change from decades ago. now it won't actually stop the worst effects of climate change. So a carbon tax can't be an ultimate solution. Next, we have to admit that in the absence of an effective global scheme, individual corporations can only do so much, since the responsibility for creating a framework to combat climate change is a governmental problem. So the solution must ultimately be systemic, but that doesn't mean, corporations can't have an obligation to act within existing legal frameworks, that they still can make some impact. Now, an unstable climate also, we should recognize, negatively affects shareholders and not just other stakeholders. So there's both a fiduciary responsibility to mitigate negative effects on the climate, as well as a moral responsibility to mitigate these effects. Because the greater the negative economic impact is of climate change, the more this is going to affect shareholders. And then, of course, the worse, floods are, the more this is going to affect stakeholders and so on. Now, corporations, at the least, have a corporate social responsibility to influence activities which address climate change, since they don't have a full-blown corporate moral responsibility. Now, current corporations are not responsible for emissions emitted prior to general knowledge about long-term effects, right? It wouldn't make sense to say, hey, this business that started 5 years ago, we're going to hold you responsible for climate change in general, because that business did not emit the majority of emissions into the atmosphere, right? So we have to be able to differentiate businesses that have had long-term negative effects on climate change and those that are just caught up in the system, that they would prefer to operate using green energy, but they have no choice because they're just, in a sense, a player in the game. But we have to also consider companies like ExxonMobil, who actively lobbied against climate change efforts and who lied about climate science, that these companies bear clear moral and legal responsibility. So just the same way that cigarette companies lobbied in the past lawmakers to argue, oh, actually cigarettes can be healthy, and they lied, and they had to be held responsible, so do corporations, all the oil companies and gas companies and so on, the banks, which lobby against climate change obfuscation, where they try to say, no, actually climate change isn't happening, or no, but it's not human caused, when we know it is human caused. And what's worse is when they also lobby to pass laws to increase the ability for them to emit carbon emissions because it makes them profit. That those companies specifically have not only a moral responsibility, a corporate moral responsibility for climate change mitigation, but of course they should also be legally held responsible.